千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. So we're about to talk about Fuxi. He's one of the legendary emperors. So just like Huangdi, another one of the legendary emperors, he was said by some to be the founder of the Tao because he was said to be the source of Jing, the book of changes. But I think as you will see, the Tao doesn't really have a founder. The Tao doesn't really have a particular person who can be pointed to as the source of all the teachings. The best that one can do will be to point to nature as the source of the Tao. Let me explain. So let me first bring you this image of Fuxi, the legendary emperor. So this is a very common depiction of that legendary figure from more than 4,600 years ago. Usually the Chinese themselves will say that he's from about 5,000 years ago. So there's a few things that I want to point out first about this depiction. So first of all, if you were to take a look at the way he's dressed, he's not wearing the robes, the silk that you would typically associate with the ancient Chinese. He wore furs, as you can see. And why is he depicted wearing furs? Well, this is because he predated the flowering of Chinese civilization. He predated the invention of silk, textiles, clothing. So the way he dressed was based on his time, which was primitive. So animal furs would be used for that. Okay, so I think everyone can see the image of this legendary emperor now. You'll see some Chinese here up on top. That's actually not the focus. Take a look at the depiction here. Look at the furs. And also notice that he's barefoot. He's got no shoes on. And why is that? Well, it's because he lived in a time that was so primitive that footwear had not been invented yet. So everybody went around barefoot. Furthermore, another detail is that his toenails and his fingernails are depicted as not trimmed. And again, it's because he lived in primitive times prior to civilization. So that is a legendary emperor, not the typical depiction of emperors that you would see, that you would expect. Now, he was legendary because he was the inventor of many things, and same as Huangdi. But let me talk about what made him especially interesting. So he lived in this ancient primitive times, and he was a tribal leader, a leader of his region. And this is even before the invention of agriculture. So the ancient Chinese back in those days were actually not farmers. As you can perhaps guess by the furs, they were hunter-gatherers, prior to the invention of agriculture. So in his tribe, they, like other tribes back in those days, they would constantly have hunters head out into the woods to see if they can bring back some game, to feed the rest of the tribe. Now, Fuxi, this tribal leader, he had a special ability. He had this intuition. He had this intuition, this keen intellect and powers of observation. So he looked at the world. He looked at everything. In the ancient world, it was mostly nature. They lived in nature. He looked at nature and he could see patterns. He looked at the sky and he could see patterns. That is, from one day to the next, he started to figure out, what it means when dark clouds gather and then it began to rain. He began to figure out what kind of clouds would bring rain and what kind of clouds would simply blow past. He got better and better at it as time went on, and he began making predictions for the rest of the tribe. He would tell them, tomorrow there's going to be rain. Now, he could tell because he had seen some of the signs, which in the past, when he observed before and kept careful track, he knew that it rained. So everyone will be like, wow, how did you know that? How could you possibly know? But then the next day comes and it actually does rain. So not understanding his methodology, they naturally assumed that he must have some kind of superpower. So let me pull up that bullet, make sure everyone sees the associated text. He had this intuitive grasp of patterns in nature, and it enabled him to predict the weather. So as we look at the television news forecast of weather, we see that quite frequently. And of course, now on the internet, we have, weather forecasting channels, websites that we can visit to see what the weather is going to be like. So meteorologists today are predicting the weather using technology. Well, he was the original meteorologist, perhaps the first in the world, who was using mostly just observation and intuition to make predictions. But such was his accuracy that word about it got out in ancient times, in that ancient land. So it got to be that everyone came around to ask him, and he began to he got so overwhelmed with questions from everyone that he announced to them that, hey, listen, rather than to respond to everyone's question one by one separately, which actually takes up a lot of time given the volume of questions that he was getting on a daily basis, he would simply go to a particular tree. He would pull back the tree bark, to expose some writing surface, and then he would use a knife or a tool or implement like sharp flint to carve symbols onto the tree about the next day's weather. So that was the original weather predicting website. Of course, they didn't have the internet back then. It was just markings on a tree. But this was useful, plenty useful for the ancient people, especially to the hunters. Hunters would come to him, would look at his forecast in order to help them plan their hunting expeditions. A lot of times, these ancient hunters, when they set out, it would be for several days at a time before they can bring back, a quantity of game. So they wanted to make sure they were heading off in a direction that would not be set with terrible weather, so they can hunt. So they would constantly come by to consult with him, and later on they would be looking at the trees like everyone else. So patterns. Fuxi, no stranger to patterns. So how do we know all that? How do we know what he did with the patterns that he saw in nature, and how did that lead to the Tao? Well, that's actually next. Let me draw your attention to part of this painting that you've been staring at for a while. The bottom part. So there's a couple of things below this depiction of Fuxi, and he appears to be looking downward. His gaze is downcast. So we're going to zoom in to the very bottom part of this painting to talk about patterns. So when we zoom in on it and blow it up, we see a couple of different elements. Let's start with Bagua. That is the element on the left. To the left, we have the Bagua, or the 8 trigrams. So these two Chinese characters here, the first one is the Chinese character for 8, the number 8, and the second one is trigrams or hexagrams, depends on how you use it. So let's just call it trigrams for now. So as I mentioned, this represents the binary progression of 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64 powers of 2. So with the 8, it's composed of 3 lines. Each line can be whole or broken. So each line is either a 1 or 0. So 1 is the complete unbroken line. The broken line will be 0. So with the 3 unbroken lines, that will be binary digit 111, which, by the way, is equivalent to the decimal digit 7. To the very left of this image, you will have the 3 broken lines. Those will be 0, 0, 0 in binary, which corresponds to the decimal number 0. And so on. So depending on whether you take it from the top down or the bottom up, here you've got broken, broken, whole, 0, 0, 1, that corresponds to the decimal number 1, and so on. So that is one of the patterns that the ancients were familiar with, the expansion of powers of 2. So what about the other elements? What about to the right? Well, there's a different story associated with that. That, I hope it looks to you like a turtle. To the right, we have a turtle. According to the legendary tall tale, Fuxi, this ancient legendary emperor, this ancient tribal leader, in primitive times, he saw this particular turtle climb out of the Luohe, the Luo River, with marking on a shell depicting the 3x3 magic square. Okay, what is that? Well, this definitely deserves further explanation. Over here, I have another picture of it. In the painting, the turtle looks rather dark. You can't really tell what's on the shell. In a different depiction over here on the right-hand side, it shows the turtle with the marking clearly visible with a bunch of dots, as you can see. So the number of dots depicting the number of the digits. So for instance, in the very middle one, you see 5 dots, and that's the number 5. So let me explain. So first of all, did this ancient tribal leader actually see a turtle with markings climbing out of a river? Well, you can probably guess reasonably that no, he did not. There was, of course, no turtle. It's a legendary tale that speaks to the insights that was gained in primitive times. So let me talk about what that insight was. let's talk about the magic square. So this is the larger image of it, zoomed in, so you can tell. And if you map the dots on the back of the turtle, on the shell, to actual numbers, you get this right here. And I hope everyone can see it clearly. So on the upper left-hand corner, you got the 4 dots that corresponds to the number 4. Right below that, you get the 3 dots, the number 3. Below that, 8 dots, the number 8, and so on. I think everyone can see that. So this is mathematically, this is literally called the 3x3 magic square. It's the smallest possible magic square. So in this 3x3 matrix, it's got 9 spaces, and it's filled with digits from 1 to 9. Each digit is used once in the square. There are no repeats. So it fills the matrix completely. So this is a way to, there's no guarantee that this will be the case. What if you come up with a magic square where some of the digits are used more than once? But no, this is just a one-to-one correspondence. So symbolically, this represents a completeness in nature. That is, everything's used, nothing is wasted. So there's a question about these 2 characters here. You'll see the luo shu down here below. In Chinese, it's luo shu, and that's because shu means book here at the bottom. Luo here is referring to, you'll see depiction of water here. This is the river. Luo he is Luo River. So that's the name of the river where the magic turtle is appearing. And there are variations of the tale where what emerges from Luo is a magical beast, like a dragon horse. But then other variations say turtle. Either way, it's not really a turtle. It's not really a magical beast of any kind. It's really just insight into the universe, into reality. All right. So the thing about the magic square is that all the numbers, if you add up the numbers horizontally, any 3 digits in any direction, whether it's horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, any of the sequences of 3 digits would add up to 15. So here you can see that 4, 9, 2, that would add up to 15. 3, 5, 7, again, add up to 15. 8, 1, 6, again, 15. So that being the case, this is a symbolic representation of balance in nature. Just looking at this, we can't really tell that it's balanced in that manner. The numbers are high or low. They don't seem particularly balanced, but it's actually quite balanced in every direction. So the balance is there. It may not be obvious to the eyes, but it's there. So this is the pattern that was seen, that was understood in ancient times, about 5,000 years ago, roughly, give or take a few centuries. And it became the basis of not only I Ching, the book of changes, but also feng shui. If you were to study feng shui, this will come up. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about patterns. So these are, the contemplation that I hope everyone is starting to get into is that, why should it be that there's magic square at all? in our reality? How is it that this just works out? It seems so simple, and there's nothing, nothing that says it has to be that way, but yet it is. So there are certain patterns, there's a certain reasoning, there's something that underlies nature. The realization of that is what led to realization of the Tao. Let's keep it moving. So what about other patterns? So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in all the different patterns that one can get into in ancient times. I want to make the point, though, that whether you are living in ancient China or ancient Europe or other parts of the ancient world, that doesn't matter. As long as you are a human being, you're going to observe the world, and the wise, smart people in ancient times would begin to discern patterns. That's what this part of the chapter is talking about, that it's unclear, but as you look into it, you can begin to discern patterns emerging. You can begin to recognize the patterns. So that's what this is all about. So let's talk about the golden ratio, not from ancient China, but ancient Greece. So it looks like this, which I know is going to be not going to be really easy to understand for a whole lot of people. It's all about proportions. All it says is that the length of A and the length of B, they're in a certain proportion. A is longer than B by a certain amount. Now, the total A and B together is longer than A by a certain amount, which is equal to B, and it's the same proportion as the length of A is longer than B. That's really all the time that I want to spend on it. We're not digging into mathematics. We're just talking about ancient patterns. Patterns in reality. So what about the Fibonacci sequence? Well, if you take a look at the sequence here, what is the logic? The logic is actually super simple, super easy, just like the magic square. If you take 0 and 1 as your starting point, okay, and the rule that you have is that the next number must be the sum of the previous two numbers. That's the only rule. Then you've got 0 and 1 to start with. They add up to 1, just like the second number. So now you've got the two numbers being 1 and 1. You add them up, you get 2. And then you add up 1 and 2, you get 3. So far, 1, 2, 3 doesn't seem like a remarkable sequence, but as you go further, 2 and 3 gives you 5, 3 and 5 gives you 8, 5 and 8 gives you 13, 13 and 8 gives you 21, and this goes on and on and on. The Fibonacci sequence turns out to be intrinsically related, embedded in nature itself, in reality. It starts with a very simple rule. It goes on and on and on in a sequence that is hard to predict, but yet makes perfect sense. So it shows up again and again in mathematics. Here, what we have is what we call a Fibonacci spiral. And it's based on that sequence there, where the innermost square, the square in the very middle, is a 1 by 1 square. And then it goes on and it gets bigger and bigger, spirals bigger and bigger due to the expansion of the Fibonacci sequence. So as I talked about before, this is ancient times, but not ancient China. The golden ratio was studied in ancient Greece. The Fibonacci sequence was part of ancient Hindu mathematics. And in the year 1202 was published by Italian mathematician Fibonacci. Hence, we call it the Fibonacci numbers. So here's the point. We don't really need to dig into the mechanics of the sequences. The point is that observation and recognition of patterns is the way of all humanity. It's the Tao of people. So that is the reason why. I dig it up to talk about, as illustration of that line from the Daodejing, that when you look into the Tao, you see this image. What is the image? It's the image of patterns that are embedded in reality itself. So people have also mentioned other possible patterns that have also been uncovered, some not from the ancient world, but from the recent past. Indeed, that is the case. So more examples. Let me showcase those examples for everyone. Just a moment. Here we go. So this image here is the Mandelbrot set. So what is the Mandelbrot set? Like the Fibonacci sequence, it's generated from a very simple algorithm, and yet the result has mind-boggling complexity. So this is the image that a lot of people have seen before, are familiar with. It's usually generated by a computer because it takes too long for a human being to plot all the lines, all the numbers in the Mandelbrot set. Mandelbrot is a French mathematician. So this all happened within the last century. This is one of the more remarkable discoveries about the world, about the pattern that's embedded in the world. So one interesting thing about the Mandelbrot sets is that when you zoom into the boundary between the blackness that you see here and the rainbow color fringe, when you zoom into that, you see more and more images, more and more reflections of the Mandelbrot set itself. With this high resolution image, you can actually see right here at the tip of the Mandelbrot set, there's a small version of the entire set. That's the characteristic of the Mandelbrot set, that no matter how much you zoom in, you will continue to see smaller versions of itself, reiterating to infinity. So here is a zoom into the boundary of the Mandelbrot set. This is a tiny, tiny part of the overall image. And as you can see, within this zoomed up image, at the tip of it, you see tiny copies of the Mandelbrot set itself. It's reiterating itself again and again to infinity. It's actually also true at all the tendrils of this set. It's remarkably beautiful for something that was so simple. So how is this reflected in reality or in nature? Well, it turns out that nature is fractal throughout. And just like the circles that the ancient Chinese have seen, no matter where you look, you will see examples of fractals. This is just the image of a tree. So those who study fractal geometry soon figure out that you can take the branch of a tree and it looks like the entire tree. So the Japanese art of bonsai trees is actually to take a small branch of a much larger tree, plant it, and it will look like a tiny version of the big tree. And that works because nature is fractal. You can also look at the coastline of any island, indeed any continent, and you will see the same fractal manifestation everywhere. So it's gotten to be that people now recognize, scientists now recognize that everywhere in nature, fractal geometry rules. And they use that when they generate realistic looking computer graphics. You can have a computer algorithm generate clouds. And as long as you embed fractal geometry algorithms in computer graphics, it will come out looking just like clouds. You can also have algorithms generating terrain, mountains, range, a mountain range, hillside, and as long as you use fractal geometry, it's going to come out looking just like a realistic mountain or a cliff. So because I always want to be very mindful of not sidetracking into a different discussion. I always want to bring it back to the Tao. So I'm going to do that now. I think you get the point that I was trying to make, and that is we have all kinds of patterns that we can discern in nature. It's all part of the Tao. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.